I am Detective Pierce. Some cases are puzzles, some are crimes, and some are nightmares you can't wake from. I've walked into plenty of strange scenes, but the call I received one late autumn evening promised something unlike anything I had faced before. A manor on the outskirts of town, a clockmaker long dead, or so the neighbors insisted, and a widow who seemed wrong in ways that no ordinary fear could explain. I arrived at the Harrow estate just past dusk. The road leading to the manor was choked with fog, curling around the skeletal trees like fingers reaching to snatch anyone daring enough to come close. The manor itself rose from the hill like a giant wound in the landscape, its dark silhouette outlined against the clouded sky. Windows were dim, yet behind the glass I could make out the subtle gleam of moving shadows. Mrs. Harrow greeted me at the door. She was a small woman, pale, hands trembling as she clutched a lantern that seemed far too weak to hold back the dark pressing against the estate. Her eyes were wide, the kind of eyes that have seen too much but not enough to understand it fully. "Detective, thank God you're here," she whispered, her voice quivering like dry leaves. It's happening again." I noted the fear but said nothing. Fear is a language of its own. It tells more than words ever could. "Show me," I said quietly. She led me through the dim corridors of the manor, past portraits whose subjects seemed almost alive in the flickering light. Faces twisted in subtle ways as if following us, lips curling slightly, eyes narrowing. Every floorboard groaned underfoot, each sound echoing as though the house itself were listening. In the workshop, the source of the trouble became apparent. The clocks. Hundreds of them, from tall cases to mantelpieces, all ticking, or rather, all pretending to tick. Some chimed, but their sounds were irregular, discordant, jarring to the ear. In the center of the room stood the long case clock. The widow herself, or what had become associated with that name, was linked to it. The pendulum swung, not with gravity but with a rhythm that felt alive, almost sentient. Mrs. Harrow's voice shook. "Edward, he built them to keep her contained. But it's free now." I crouched near the long case clock, observing its face. The hands moved too smoothly, too deliberately, as if each tick was measured not in seconds, but in intentions. My instincts screamed that this was no ordinary clock. It was a vessel. And inside something waited, something patient, intelligent, and unforgiving. "Tell me what happened," I said, my voice steady despite the cold prickling at the back of my neck. Mrs. Harrow's lips quivered. "It started with the first chime, after Edward died. Every evening at the same time, a shadow would appear behind the glass. A figure, wearing his face. But the eyes, they weren't his. And it would whisper my name. Then things would move. Gears spinning on their own, pendulums swinging without rhythm, clocks striking impossible hours." I nodded slowly, cataloging every detail. This wasn't simple grief. This wasn't a prank or a malfunction. This was something that had learned the shape of fear and was now feeding on it. "We need to understand the network," I said, moving among the clocks. "Every clock in this house, every chime, every hidden compartment, it's all connected. If we can map it, maybe we can predict its movements. Maybe we can contain it." Mrs. Harrow followed, her lantern casting long shadows. "And if we can't?" I didn't answer. Sometimes the truth was too heavy for the living. Instead, I opened the first of the clocks, an ornate mantelpiece with a delicate keyhole. Inside, the gears were arranged not for keeping time, but for something else, something I couldn't yet name. Tiny scratches marked the interior, almost like runes. A faint humming resonated from within, not mechanical but alive. I felt the presence before I heard it, a subtle shift in the air, a movement in the shadows that made the hairs on my arms stand. I straightened slowly. The widow, or what had become associated with her name, was aware of me now. Testing me. Watching, calculating. We worked through the evening, mapping the clocks, noting anomalies. Each one had a personality, a signature. Some were aggressive, chiming violently at random intervals. Others were subtle, their hands moving backward for moments before resuming. And then there was the long case, the queen among them, quiet but seething, its pendulum swinging with a hypnotic menace. As the night deepened, I realized something chilling. The clocks didn't just measure time, they observed it. They remembered. And the widow remembered too. Every sorrow, every regret, every sleepless hour Mrs. Harrow had suffered in this house was catalogued, etched into the movements of the gears, woven into the ticking that refused to cease. And then I heard it, the first whisper, faint, almost a suggestion, curling around the corners of the workshop. Pierce! I froze. This was no ordinary case. This was a house alive with memory, obsession, and the presence of a woman long dead, or perhaps never fully alive in the way we understand life. And the next 24 hours would decide whether I was merely an observer, or a participant in a nightmare that could swallow us all. I moved cautiously through the workshop, my eyes darting from one clock to another. Each tick seemed amplified in the silence, a metronome counting down to something I could not yet name. Mrs. Harrow lingered near the doorway, her lantern trembling in her grasp, casting uncertain shadows across the walls. Pierce, it's watching, she whispered, barely audible. I know, I said, not taking my eyes off the clocks. And it's learning. We have to be careful. Any sudden movement, any misstep, and it could turn on us. The long case clock loomed ahead, its pendulum swinging with an almost hypnotic precision. I felt the air around it thicken, heavy with a sense of expectation. Leaning closer, I examined the carvings along the wood. At first glance, they appeared to be mere decorative flourishes, curves, lines, floral patterns. But as I traced them with my fingers, I realized they formed a kind of code. A pattern. Not just aesthetic, but intentional. Someone, or something, had designed this with purpose. I crouched to peer inside a smaller mantel clock. The gears were intricately interlocked, each one turning independently yet in perfect synchronization with its neighbors. Tiny scratches marred the metal surfaces, forming letters and symbols I didn't recognize. They seemed to pulse with a rhythm all their own, almost like a heartbeat. And then I heard it again, a soft whisper, so close it felt as though it had brushed my ear. Pierce! I spun around, but the room was empty. Mrs. Harrow clutched her lantern closer, eyes wide. Did you hear it? I did, I replied calmly, though my stomach churned. It's communicating. We need to document every anomaly before we proceed. We spent hours moving from one clock to another, taking notes, mapping the house, and recording every irregularity. Some clocks struck impossible hours, 23, 30, 72. Others chimed with a distorted melody, almost musical but jarring. The whispering clock, as I began to call it, seemed to react to our presence, its hands twitching whenever I focused on another. By midnight, the air had grown colder, and the shadows longer. I noticed that our reflections in the glass faces of the clocks were distorted, stretched, twisted, almost as if the clocks were not only recording time but reshaping reality itself. Mrs. Harrow shivered. They're changing us. Not yet, I said, though the doubt crept in. But we must tread carefully. I moved to the long case again, examining the pendulum. There was something hypnotic about it, a rhythm that drew my eyes in despite my will. I felt a pull in my chest, a strange vertigo, as though the pendulum was resonating with something inside me. I forced myself to step back, shaking my head. Focus, Pierce. Focus. Then I noticed the first real manifestation of the widow. A figure, faint at first, emerged behind the glass of the long case. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her presence was undeniable. She did not move in a human way. Her head tilted in impossible angles, and when she raised a hand, the pendulum seemed to accelerate, as though acknowledging her gesture. Mrs. Harrow gasped. She's here." I nodded, keeping my voice calm. "Yes. And she's aware of us. Remember, these are her domain. Every clock, every chime, it's her eyes, her hands, her voice. Do not provoke her." I circled the long case, taking in every detail. The wood seemed to pulse under my fingers, the carvings almost alive. Tiny movements, imperceptible at first, began to ripple through the brass gears. The whispering clock responded, its hands jerking violently, as if screaming silently. And the pendulum, oh, the pendulum! It seemed to breathe, swinging faster and slower in rhythm with my own heartbeat. Then, abruptly, silence. The entire workshop fell into a stillness so profound it was almost unbearable. Even the clocks that had been ticking, chiming, whispering, stopped. I held my breath, sensing that the widow was observing, calculating. The tension was electric, and I knew that the first real challenge was coming. A sudden clang shattered the quiet. A clock on the far wall, previously dormant, had struck 12, though the hour was impossible, the hands pointing to neither present nor future. And in that instant, the figure behind the long case glass became fully visible, the widow. Her face pale, eyes hollow but burning with intent, lips curved in a smile that was both inviting and menacing. She raised both hands, and the workshop seemed to respond, gears spinning frantically, clocks rattling, pendulums flailing. I knew then that we had crossed the threshold. She was no longer a shadow or a whisper. She was fully awake, fully present, and fully aware of us. Mrs. Harrow clutched my arm, trembling. "Pierce, we can't." "We can," I said firmly, trying to steady my own racing heart. "We have to understand her, or she will destroy us. Every clock, every gear is a piece of the puzzle. And if we solve it, maybe we survive." The widow tilted her head, as if amused by my resolve. And then, slowly, deliberately, she began to move. Not toward us, not yet, but around the room, her presence brushing against the surfaces, making the clocks pulse in response. I felt the weight of every second, every chime, every whisper. This was no ordinary case. The widow had woven herself into the very fabric of the house, and now, she was testing us. And I, Detective Pierce, was trapped inside her world, where every tick of the clock was a heartbeat, and every chime a warning. The workshop seemed to breathe around us, alive with the sound of ticking that wasn't always ticking, chimes that didn't always chime. Every clock, no matter the size, the shape, or the age, had become a sensor, a nerve ending in the body of the house. And the widow, the woman, or perhaps something more, moved like a conductor, orchestrating the chaos with every flick of her hand. I motioned Mrs. Harrow to follow me as I approached the whispering clock. Its face had warped again, the numbers twisted into shapes that resembled letters, forming words too quickly for comprehension. But the sensation it gave me, a low vibration through my fingertips, was undeniable. It was trying to communicate. Or perhaps warn. I think these clocks are memories," I whispered, almost to myself. "Not just keeping time, but preserving events, emotions, fear." My eyes darted to the widow. Her head tilted sharply, almost in approval. "And she's feeding off it." Mrs. Harrow shivered. "What does she want from us?" "Not us," I said grimly. "Knowledge. Response. Interaction. She tests the boundaries." One wrong move, and the clocks themselves will punish us. The room had darkened subtly. The lanterns flickered though no breeze stirred. I noticed the shadows now clung to corners in impossible ways, stretching along walls, snaking across the floor. The widow glided through these shadows, her form almost melting into them, yet leaving an unmistakable trail of motion, a distortion in the air itself. We needed a plan. Standing still would invite disaster. I drew Mrs. Harrow toward a table strewn with tools and open clock mechanisms. The scent of old wood, oiled brass, and candle wax mingled with something sharper, metallic, like iron filings scattered in the wind. I began examining a large wall clock, its pendulum swinging erratically. If we can synchronize the clocks, maybe we can disrupt her control, I said, testing each gear with my fingers. The pendulum jerked in response, a shiver running through the entire assembly. She's linked to all of them. If we can break the resonance. A shriek cut through the workshop, a sound like glass splitting, metal bending, and human scream all at once. We froze. The whispering clock's hands had gone berserk, spinning so fast they were almost invisible. And there she was again, the widow, her mouth opening impossibly wide, eyes glowing with the reflection of countless brass gears. The air around her vibrated, carrying a high-pitched hum that made my teeth chatter. "Pierce!" Mrs. Harrow cried, clutching my sleeve. She's... I didn't wait to hear the rest. I reached for the largest wrench on the table and lunged at the whispering clock. As I turned the gears, I felt her presence like a weight pressing against my chest. The room trembled, and I could see every other clock responding, hands twitching, pendulums jerking, dials spinning without restraint. And then silence. It was abrupt, unnatural. The widow had stopped moving. The clocks, too, were frozen mid-chime. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Harrow and I exchanged a look, realizing that this pause was not mercy, it was opportunity. I knelt beside the whispering clock and inspected the mechanism more closely. Hidden within the brass gears, almost invisible, was a tiny keyhole, ancient and worn. No ordinary clock key would fit. My mind raced. This was the nexus. The point that controlled the resonance, the channel through which the widow exerted her influence. "Mrs. Harrow," I whispered, glancing at her pale, trembling face. "We need to find a way to open this. Whatever's inside, it may give us a chance to end this." She nodded silently, fear etched into every line of her face, but I saw the spark of resolve there too. She understood. If we failed, the house would consume us, and every tick of every clock would become the last thing we ever heard. I took a deep breath, feeling the vibration of the whispering clock through the soles of my boots. I was Detective Pierce, alone in a house alive with the memories and rage of a ghost, confronting a woman, or something more, that had fused with time itself. And somewhere, beyond the walls, the clocks were waiting for me to make a mistake. I slid my hand over the keyhole. The widow's head turned, almost imperceptibly. Her lips curled in a faint, knowing smile. And the clocks began to tick again, slowly at first, then building in a crescendo that seemed to match the hammering of my heart. Every second counted. Every movement mattered. And the next move I made could be our last. I reached for the small brass key I had found hidden among the tools earlier, its surface cold and etched with tiny symbols I couldn't decipher. As my fingers brushed it, the whispering clock shivered subtly, as if aware I intended to unlock it. Mrs. Harrow's hand hovered over mine, trembling, but she didn't pull away. She trusted me, or perhaps knew there was no other choice. I inserted the key. It fit perfectly. The clock shuddered violently, the hands spinning backward and forward, faster than the eye could track. The sound was unbearable, a grinding, metallic wail that rattled the windows and made the floorboards vibrate beneath our feet. I could feel it in my chest, a pressure that threatened to push the air from my lungs. "Pierce! What's happening?" Mrs. Harrow screamed, clutching at the table for support. "I'm not sure," I shouted over the cacophony. It's like time itself is resisting." The room began to warp. Clocks grew larger, smaller, some stretching toward the ceiling, others sinking into the floor. The walls twisted subtly, as though the house itself were made of rubber. Shadows spilled from every corner, dark and fluid, merging into shapes I didn't recognize. And then I saw her, the widow. She was no longer fully human, her body stretched impossibly, a living amalgamation of gears and shadow. Her face split into dozens of overlapping masks, each echoing screams that had never been heard. "You should not have done that," she whispered, her voice layered with hundreds of others. "Time belongs to me." I swallowed, forcing my fear down. "Maybe not entirely," I said, though my voice trembled. "Some things aren't yours to control." Mrs. Harrow stepped closer, holding a small mallet she'd grabbed from the table. "Pierce, what do we do?" I glanced at the key, then back at the widow. "We have to sever her connection to the clocks. Hit the mainspring." We moved together, dodging the shadows that reached for us like liquid fingers. I swung the mallet at the central gear of the whispering clock. Sparks flew, and a high-pitched ringing filled the room, piercing and shrill. The widow screamed, a sound that was both human and mechanical, echoing from every clock in the house. The clocks around us began to slow, their frantic spinning easing into a steady, synchronized tick. The walls creaked as though protesting, shadows receding but leaving faint impressions on the warped surfaces. The widow's form flickered, destabilizing, her mask spinning like shattered clock faces. "Again!" I yelled to Mrs. Harrow. She swung the mallet, striking the mainspring with precision. The sound of twisting metal, snapping teeth of gears, and groaning wood filled the room. The widow's scream grew, then faltered. Time itself seemed to shiver. One by one, the clocks returned to their normal size and shape. The room stilled. Silence fell, heavy and complete. The whispering clocks sat dormant, the hands frozen at 12:01. No sound, no vibration, no warning. Even the air seemed to pause in relief. Mrs. Harrow sank to her knees, trembling. Is it over?" I shook my head slowly. "Not entirely. She's weakened, but she's not gone. The clocks are bound to her, and she's bound to them. We've survived this encounter, but we've only scratched the surface of her power." I examined the clock carefully. The key had turned to dust in my hand, leaving behind only faint etchings that glimmered briefly before fading. The mechanism seemed inert, yet I knew the widow's essence lingered, hidden, patient, waiting for another opportunity. "We need to leave," I said, helping Mrs. Harrow to her feet. "Every second we stay is a risk. She can return at any moment." As we moved toward the door, the workshop seemed almost normal again. Dust motes drifted lazily in the lantern light. The shadows were in their proper places. And yet, somewhere in the faint ticking of the remaining clocks, I could hear it, a whisper, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. "Time belongs to me." I glanced at Mrs. Harrow. She understood without words. The house had tested us, and we had survived, but the widow remained, watching, waiting. Outside, the night was calm. The moon cast a silver glow over the cobbled streets, the world seemingly unaware of the horrors inside the house. But I knew better. I always knew better. I was Detective Pierce. And somewhere in that house, the widow's clocks were still ticking, counting down toward the moment she would rise again. We walked into the night, silent, but I felt the weight of every second pressing against my mind. One day, the clocks would tick again, and when they did, I would be ready.